Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Kyle Gingrich Hebert, and I serve as director of the Toronto Mennonite Theological Center, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this book launch symposium for Max Kennel's new book entitled Postsecular History, Political Theology and the Politics of Time. For those of you that may not be familiar with TMTC, we are a graduate teaching and research center of Conrad Grebel University College, affiliated with the Toronto School of Theology and supported by a number of Mennonite academic institutions and denominational bodies. Events like this one emerge out of TMTC's long-standing vision of being a Mennonite presence at the Toronto School of Theology and seek to strengthen relationships between the many institutions and communities that TMTC is supported by and seeks to serve. I'm grateful that each of you have joined us today for what promises to be a thought-provoking and engaging 90 minutes or so. So I want to begin by acknowledging the sacred land on which TMTC operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. As part of Conrad Grebel University College in Waterloo, TMTC is also privileged to operate on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River, that is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. I also want to acknowledge that many others are joining us from across Turtle Island and beyond. Before we get things properly underway, I want to offer a few brief announcements and words of thanks. First, please note that we are recording this event and will make this available online in the coming weeks for those who could not be with us today. Second, and perhaps this goes without saying, given the ubiquity of our use of online platforms these days, but please ensure your microphones are muted unless you are asking a question. You can feel free to turn your video off for our initial time together, but I would encourage you, if possible, to turn your video back on for the Q&A time so that we can foster an engaged dialogue. It's sometimes unsettling for people to just be speaking into the ether. So if possible, I would encourage you to do that. Third, we will be taking written questions in the chat, and you are also welcome to ask your own questions. You can do that by using the raise hand function. There may be enough that I can see everyone on the screen, so you could just give a wave to if that's easier for you. Finally, I want to thank my Grebel colleague, Becca Smoot-Entz. She is here with us today. All of you will have been in contact with her, and she's monitoring email addresses and various Zoom functions and is available to assist with any technical questions you may have. So with that, I am going to turn to our panelists today. We have 4 wonderful panelists going to engage this book and open up dialogue on it with us. So first, Michael Driedger is with us. He's Associate Professor of History at Brock University. His ongoing research is about the relationship between the Radical Reformation and the Radical Enlightenment, particularly the activities of Mennonite publishers, philosophers, and political activists in the Dutch Republic of the 17th and 18th centuries. He is the author of Obedient Heretics, co-author of Bernard Rothman and the Reformation in Munster, and co-editor of several collections of essays about early modern history. His broader research interests concern the comparative study of religious minorities and new religious movements around the world from the 15th to the 18th centuries, and the relationship between early modern politics and religion. So welcome, glad to have you with us today, Mike.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try sharing my screen quickly. I have a bit of a slideshow. I hope you can see some slides now. Is that the case? Okay, wonderful. I'll put this into presentation mode. And of course, congratulations, Max. This is quite an accomplishment. Any publication of a book is a great accomplishment. As a first book, I think. Wow, right? And I am also very grateful and humbled that you've put so much thought and effort into a dialogue with some of my work. I want to continue that dialogue right now by adding new ideas and maybe highlighting a few of the ideas that you do that are important in your book, particularly the chapter on fanaticism, which emerged out of a set of dialogues that you had, I believe, with me and some of my PhD students, and Travis and some of his PhD students. I, in addition to work on Mennonite politics, have done some work, as Kyle mentioned, on the famous or infamous case of Anabaptist rule in the city of Munster in 1534-35. And I'm very glad that Pandora Press is the publisher of this book. Max knows something about that press, and you'll probably hear more about it from him, the press that is. This episode is infamous in the study of political theology, just generally, because if political theologians tend to raise any issue in Mennonite or Anabaptist studies, it's usually this episode in 1534-35. It's actually been in discussion as a topic in theological political thought for a long time. And I'll give you just one example here. This is a stanza from a poem that was published around 1700 in central Germany by a collaboration of anonymous Lutheran publishers. Thomas Munzer, John of Leyden, and Knipperdolink are dead. It is true, but their spirit and inheritance have not been destroyed. This is Thomas Munzer, a famous preacher of the Peasants' War of 1525, and John of Leyden and Bernd Knipperdolink, two of the famous leaders of the besieged city of Munster in 1534, were executed horribly in 1536. This stanza highlights a problem that comes up again and again, I think, in historical discussions, political theology related to Anabaptists. And Max has been pushing back against this kind of a representation. One of the discussion partners in his, or subjects in his fourth chapter, is Alberto Toscano, in this book by Toscano in particular, Fanaticism, on the uses of an idea. And what I want to do in just a few minutes is highlight one further idea that stands out for me in this book that I think also resonates very importantly and closely with central ideas that Max puts forward in post-secular history, but while Max includes several pages of very thoughtful analysis on central ideas from Toscano's book, and agrees with Toscano in so many ways about the dangers of using fanaticism as a political weapon. The idea of a short circuit, a historical short circuit, is one we're thinking a little bit more about, I would suggest. I'll give a few examples. So first, the historical short circuit. I'm going to have to move the, I've got everybody's face in the way of the screen here. So in Toscano's introduction, he defines a short circuit in this passage, whether it is a short circuit between Lenin, Hitler, and Thomas Munzer in Norman Cohn's seminal book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, Michel Foucault's sympathetic analogies between the spiritualization of politics in the Iranian Revolution and the figures of Cromwell and Savonarola, or Hegel's pairing of Mohammed and Robespierre, I scratch my head at that one, in the philosophy of history. The discourse on fanaticism seems to suggest that when it comes to the politics and subjectivity of unconventional conviction, we can ignore chronology and geography. Toscano wants to push back against this kind of short circuit, which seems also to have so many, to be so much of the part of what Max is also trying to do in his book in many ways. I am frustrated again and again by how the topic of Anabaptist history gets raised in so many important books in political theology. Here are a few examples. This slide includes titles of books that some quite distant, that still distant in time, that still have huge influence, such as Eric Voegelin's New Science of Politics, where Voegelin makes a strange comparison between medieval mystics, the Anabaptists of the 16th century, and of course, who else? Adolf Hitler. What evidence does Voegelin provide for this insight? Well, none. It's simply a mystical kind of truthiness, to use Stephen Colbert's term, for a truth that we know in our gut. A few years after the publication of the New Science of Politics, Norman Cohn produced what many scholars have taken as a huge historical support for a Voegelinian point of view. The Pursuit of the Millennium looks at millenarian, medieval millenarian political groups that were in tension with established authorities from about the 10th century until the 16th century. And the Anabaptists of Münster are the last and crowning chapter of this book. The book, to give you an example of a short circuit, in its 1961 second edition has this subtitle: Revolutionary Messianism in Medieval and Reformation Europe. And here's the weird part: and its bearing on modern totalitarian movements. Again, head scratch. That's a short circuit, a connection between a dangerous past and a dangerous present that is the only evidence for it is the mystical insight of the author at hand. Now, one person who has taken these 1950s scholarly insights and kept them alive in current political discussions is the London School of Economics philosopher John Gray, who also writes in such mainstream publications as The Guardian, for example. He's one of The Guardian's conservatives. Black Mass is a book that is about 20th and 21st century state violence in so many ways, but it opens with the case of Anabaptist Münster, at least as mediated through the story of Norman Cohn in Pursuit of the Millennium. Since 2007 in Black Mass, John Gray has compared the Anabaptists of Münster and their dangers with, get this, both ISIS at the height of the ISIS controversies of about a decade ago, and more recently, progressive wokeness. Whoa, this is weirdness. John Gray is one of the big translators of Norman Cohn's Pursuit of the Millennium into current political theological discussions. And this comparison of the use of the examples of Thomas Münster and the Anabaptists of Münster in the 16th century as a starting point for discussions about other political and social topics is William Bernstein's very recent book, The Delusions of Crowds. It's really, the problem of a short circuit that Toscano highlights is one that we should be paying attention to, and Max's book provides us with tools for thinking in other ways about the problems of short circuits. I'm going to give you just a few other examples of short circuits quickly in just a few minutes. These short circuits come up in comical ways as well, and here's a punk rock connection. In 1989, in a great book on the history of punk rock by Greil Marcus called Lipstick Traces, Marcus, a great rock and roll writer, points out or suggests connections between Johnny Rotten, who was born John Lydon, like John of Leyden, the lead singer of the Sex Pistols, and John of Leyden. The connections are complicated and really tangential and based on all kinds of short circuits, but they're lighthearted. And if anyone ever says to me, well, John of Leyden, isn't he a precursor of Hitler? Well, he's as much a precursor of Johnny Rotten as anybody else. These, I think one way of dealing with short circuits is to provide other short circuits that are just as meaningful and just as junky, but much more fun. There's even more connections here. I won't get into them, but here's some other weird comic short circuits. These are from German penny store novels and comic books. There have been comparisons between the Anabaptists of Munster and zombies. In fact, this story from the Mark Hellman Demon Hunters series suggests that the Anabaptists of Munster have been resurrected as vampires, and that's so 1980s, right? Vampires, old stuff. Well, what's more current? Zombies. There's another comic book, also based out of Germany and Munster, in fact, in the Kim Luna series, which imagines that the Anabaptists of Munster have risen up as modern zombies. Some more short circuits. Now, finally, I will raise another book that I think would be a great subject for further discussions of these kinds of topics. There's a myth that goes back to the era of early modern religious warfare and the persecution of Anabaptists, the myth of Anabaptist madness. To counter that, we could maybe also look at the myth of religious violence that William Cavanaugh and so many others have been trying to counteract. Max does cite Cavanaugh, but other work by Cavanaugh in his collection. Many of the concerns that Cavanaugh has, Max also has as well. These are big subjects. This is not a critique that Max is not in dialogue with this book. There's just so much, so many big issues that Max raises, and so well in an engaging way. I want to say thank you again for the book, and look forward to further conversations.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks so much, Mike. That's fantastic. I don't know about the rest of you, but I haven't seen any of those comic books. So that's tremendously interesting. I think we'll have fun getting into some of that. Our next panelist today is Pamela Klassen. She's professor in the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. She's the author and co-author of many books and articles, including The Story of Radio Mind, A Missionary's Journey on Indigenous Land, and with Paul Christopher Johnson and Winifred Sullivan, Ecclesia, 3 Inquiries in Church and State. She teaches graduate and undergraduate students in the areas of anthropology and history of Christianity and colonialism in North America, religion in the public sphere, and religion, law, media, and gender. She currently holds the Annalise Meyer Research Award from the Humboldt Foundation in support of a 5-year collaborative project entitled Religion and Public Memory in Multicultural Societies. Wonderful to have you with us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kyle. It's a real honor to be here. I think maybe you didn't say this part, but one of my great honors is that I am the postdoctoral supervisor of Maxwell Kennel, who is a short postdoc at the University of Toronto, and is I guess part of the reason why I'm on this panel, because I was generously invited to participate by Max. So thank you so much, Max. It was a real treat to read your book. I will make a quick comment about the zombies on the comic books. I have not seen them before either, but my dissertation advisor was actually a scholar of Haitian voodoo, and there's clearly a lot to be thinking about in the ways zombies have been used and appropriated and misunderstood in many different contexts. And so I think that actually ties into one of the themes that I want to sort of think through in conversation with Max's book is when you think about time and history, how do you also need to think about place and story and how things travel? So what I wanted the comments that I sort of put together, I entitled them Time Immemorial, Here and Now. And the here and now thing also sends me off on a little short jaunt first. I was thinking about this weekend with what is going on in Ukraine right now, that I come from a family that considers themselves to be Russian Mennonites, and it made me think in new ways, why is that such a naturalized term for us? I mean, obviously it's would be anachronistic to think about people who left or would it be obvious? I don't know. Since my family came to Canada in the 1870s, which is a whole other story about our relationship with Indigenous peoples and Métis people of Manitoba. But what does it mean that we keep calling ourselves Russian Mennonites in a place that was, when I was younger, I would say South Russia, what's now Ukraine? What I don't know. Anyways, just wondering if anybody's been thinking about similar kinds of things today, these days. Okay, so I'm going to launch into my response to Max, but I do think that much of what you're writing about actually helps us think about some of the violence in the world that we see today. So I'm gonna read I don't have any slides. I'm just gonna sort of read what I've got here and see where we get to. So reading Maxwell Kennel's Postsecular History, Political Theology, and the Politics of Time was for me a very fascinating journey across time and text. There's a lot of, I would have asked, if I could see you all, I would ask for a hand raise, but how many people have actually read the book? Because that would be interesting. But there are a lot of different readers, a lot of different texts that you need to sort of get through in reading Max's synthesis and achievement here, but it is super fascinating. So we've got Augustine's Confessions, Melville's Moby Dick, stops along the way to consider how historians of the Radical Reformation have attended to or ignored Dutch collegians, and why Dorothee Sölle espoused a willingness to wait in the way that Max understands her. And he makes an argument about the politics of periodization that is anchored by this word, the concept of the post-secular. And I want to think a bit about what that means to anchor your argument so much on this particular word. I'm not totally sure what Max thinks about the post-secular. So I mean, obviously I know a lot about what he thinks about the post-secular, but I want to know, does he want to use it in his next book? What, are you carrying it with you, or are you done with it now? So I want to know a bit about that. I am going to quote quite a bit from him here, just to sort of give you Max in his own words, in case you haven't read the book. So he defines he frames his work in this way, quote, "It is time to work against the forward-facing implications of its prefix, the post in post-secular, and turn the post-secular towards the past while asking what a post-secular history might entail." So I've tried to pull out some of the juiciest bits of how he frames his project. So I take Max's argument to be rooted in a wider conversation that seeks to understand the ongoing power of secularized theological concepts in contemporary political life in Europe and North America largely. He's insisting that this is not only a modern concern, whatever modern means, of course. So hence we have the Dutch collegians, who I guess you might consider early modern, but anyways. So for Max, periodization itself is always political, which is, something other scholars have pointed to as well. And he writes, "I understand periodization to be a powerful and often hidden act of political and theological power. Any account of the political nature of time or history must reckon with the notion that time and history are never only secular, and furthermore, that the periodization of time and history are frequently used as instruments of political power." I think this is a very important point that we can see in action today. Understandably, Max's definition of the post-secular, since the whole book is about the post-secular history, it's a little more difficult to encapsulate, but here's one version of how he defines the post-secular. The post-secular, quote, "The post-secular is a name for thinking amidst normative entanglements, and it is a term that can assist us in questioning the powerful categories like religion and secularity that we use to divide the world. So here the post-secular is something that helps us ask the questions we need to ask." So at some points, I read the book as an attempt to rejuvenate the post-secular through attention to time and history. At other points, it strikes me more as a sort of series of readings of theorists and texts and points in history that is seeking a sort of cautious way forward for a non-triumphalist political theology that has a recurring Christian refrain to it, that is also attentive to the dangers of power and practices of legitimation. And that's a hard job, but I think he does a good job of it. So as Max asks in his own words, how can time and history be remediated after so many periodizing habits and narratives of progress have been found to be inextricably intertwined with the very problematic theological patterns of teleological providence, wherein meaning is made compulsory? That is a very difficult quote, and I should probably spend the next 30 minutes unpacking it, but I'll let Max do that later. But one of the things that I want to point out here is that he's got this a deep suspicion around narratives of progress, and also quite a lot of questions around providence, where interestingly, and this just is happenstance, I've been thinking a lot with providence and empire lately, building up the work of several different people, but especially in terms of, I'm working on a project on gold mining. I'm not going to get into that right now because it would take too long to explain. But the notion of the providential is a way of sort of sacralizing, enchanting imperialism, but it's also a little bit more complicated, which I'll get to in a second. So I'm very convinced by Max's point that thinking about time and history is helpful for thinking in new ways about the post-secular and its uses and its abuses. But I also do wonder how place and story fit into the argument. So at one point, Max, you draw a distinction. I have shared all these comments with Max before too, just so you know. Matt, I've given him all time to think about it. About 12 hours. So Max also draws a distinction between space and time. And he writes that, quote, spatial and territorial expressions of sovereignty are relatively familiar in political theology. For example, the geopolitical power maintained by the physical borders of nation states. But we should extend our vision of sovereign power further towards time and ask, why does power take time? He has many excellent turns of phrase in this book, I have to say. So I've sensed a kind of like wanting to move away from space in the argument, which, you know, is fine, but I'm going to ask you to bring it in a little more. So I would argue that place and story are just as important as time and history. And I mean, you could here, it would be interesting to engage with Jonathan C. Smith's To Take Place, which does the same thing that you are doing with power taking time. So if we're dividing the world with time and history on one side and place and story on the other, that might actually distract us from seeing how stories and time work differently in different places shaped by the land. But also I think that the comic books show us a different version of that as well. And so this is maybe just a simple question, but maybe it's not at all, I don't know. I do wonder what counts as theology and what counts as religion in Max's argument. And I wonder if theology is always Christian, and if so, what kind of Christian? And I mean, this is coming from a religion scholar, so I'm just always wondering what people mean when they say theology. And I'm always wondering what people mean when they say religion. So when is religion really Christianity, and when is it otherwise? When is it something else? I also just feel that I need to register a strong disagreement with anachronistic deployments of religion by writers such as Daniel Barber. So not Max here, but Max quotes him saying that from your quote, I should go back and read his text. Fair, that would be fair to say. Barber seems to think that Paul played a part in, quote, fundamentally and irreversibly changing the meaning of the category of religion, which I just highly doubt. Maybe people's uses of Paul have done that, but I'm pretty sure that Paul didn't do that. So overall, though, I would say that post-secular history seems to be written in conversation with Christianity. I don't think that's a big surprise. But here's where a discussion of Max's discussion of stories becomes interesting, because this is where some religious breadth comes into play. Again, one more. I think this is one last quote from Max. Unacknowledged attentions and desires inherited from certain religious traditions do contribute to the resonance that certain stories have, particularly stories that seek out and find meaning in past events by bestowing upon them or discovering within them a providential status or a sense of having been given rather than merely occurring. So stories work in certain times and places because they have resonance, there's memory that is carried with them, they seem appropriate to the time, or they seem to have been given and naturalized. But I do wonder if a providential story is necessarily triumphalist. And here, this is just a thought. When Indigenous people, specific Indigenous people, understand themselves to have been on their territory because the Creator placed them there since time immemorial, is that a providential claim? What kind of claim is that? What does that time that we cannot remember mean and do in the present, in the here and now? How does time shape relationality to land differently according to various religious and or spiritual traditions? And here I strongly recommend the work of Jean O'Brien, who's written a brilliant book called Firsting and Lasting on different ways that settlers claimed indigenous territory, and religion actually is kind of an undercurrent. Many of her sources are actually 19th century Northeastern ministers who are sort of amateur historians. And then also a recent article by Kim Tallbear called Caretaking Relations, Not American Dreaming. I also have a side note here on cyclical time, but I'm not going to go into that. So in my work, I've often emphasized that the secular is always also local and located in specific places and narratives. Secular ideas and secular geologies, that's the gold mining stuff, have played a role in mapping and claiming indigenous territory in collaboration with Christian cosmologies of land and tools of property. Together with Winnie Sullivan and Paul Johnson in that book, Ecclesia, we've called this church stateness. I should say that when I'm thinking about secular geology, I'm also thinking about geological uses of the word secular, which have a very specific meaning in terms of ages of the earth, which I think is an interesting, I call it a kind of found concept that I like to think with. So a focus on time and history can be quite helpfully combined with an interest in place and narrative. And I'm quite sure Max is not going to disagree with me on this. I'm just thinking of the biblically inflected imperial phrase about an empire on which the sun never sets is a kind of medley of time and place and power that's at once sort of providential and eternal, at least for a while. So on varied occasions, Max also invokes the notion of polemics or a polemical concept, and the work on fanaticism kind of ties in here too. In my own work, I've also found it very helpful to think about polemical concepts in the following way, thinking about a concept that's a concept is an argument in the guise of a category. So it's a category, but really it's like making an intervention. And I consider Christianity itself pretty much always to be a polemical concept. In another a paper that I worked on that topic, I think it is called Christianity as a Polemical Concept. I think about Gil Anajar's work and Tal Assad's work, and think about Christianity as a concept that's never just natural or factual. It's a concept that does, as I put it, a certain kind of analytical and argumentative work in both scholarly and popular conversation. Put another way, it's always worth defining what one means by Christianity, as that is rarely self-evident. So in thinking this way about Christianity, I definitely agree with Max that time is of the essence. And I have to say, it's way too easy to make puns with time. And he does as many good ones throughout the book. So whether it's like cyclical, aggressive inclusivity of Christmas, Max cites my work with Monique Scher on Christmas, which I very much appreciate. Thank you. Or the linear progression of the yearly calendar, Christianity is often pulling people back to a first century Anno Domini kind of anchor. For some Christians, this might take a sort of like, what would Jesus do vibe? How should I act in the 21st century, pretending I'm in the first? For those who are not Christian, it's often an implicitly sort of Christian seasonal habitus that is just kind of irritating and unavoidable. So I think just to close, I want to turn to how this question about place and something that Max develops at the end of the book around the idea of the figural and figural history. So at the end of the book, he turns to a discussion of the figural F-I-G-U-R history, and he gestures to time that's embodied in place and form, and he's thinking about mediation and images, and which he's also talked about earlier in the book. And here at the end, he borrows from Erich Auerbach, and so he sort of Max maintains his suspicion of the promises of the post-secular for a bunch of different reasons, which I won't go into, but he holds out a bit more hope for this figural thinking. And he argues, there's one last quote from Max. This is truly my last quote. The challenge for any present use of figural thinking is to take up its rich account of historical and temporal fulfillment in a post-secular way that would avoid deciding whether these fulfillments are ideally Christian, religious, or secular. And there is a kind of trinity that Max often uses of Christian, religious, and secular in the book. So figural thinking, you would also hope, he's arguing here, in a way, taking up figural thinking in a way that would remediate past, present, and future and draw together origins and ends without either erasing or making compulsory experiences of disappointment and suffering, meaning or meaninglessness. So a way to sort of draw on the past without having a given understanding of what it has to mean is kind of how I take that. So I was not entirely sure that I fully understood the role of figural thinking. So I looked around a bit for others, how others had understood Auerbach in this vein. And I found an article, unsurprisingly, called Disfigurations, Erich Auerbach's Theory of Figura by James I. Porter, who's a very interesting writer whose work I had not read before, but it's nice because he's a classicist who reads religious studies. That's very exciting. He argues that any analysis of Auerbach's use of the figural cannot be separated from the immediate context in which Auerbach was writing as a Jewish scholar exiled for Germany in 1938. And Porter also argues that for Auerbach, the story of Figura revealed these ruptures and successions between the pagan antiquity and in quotes and early Christianity that were not remedies for the anti-Jewishness of the past or the present. So Porter does not concern himself with the concept of the postsecular at all, but very interestingly for me, he insists that for Auerbach, the secular matters. And Porter's writing in 2017. For Porter, he writes, Auerbach's allegiances are to the secular world, but to a secular world that is understood in a particular way. It is a reality of people and peoples, of individuals and nations, but not of the elite, as in classical antiquity, or the elect, as in both the Jewish and Christian traditions. It is the earthly reality of the here and now, not the beyond. So in a way, he's writing about Auerbach sort of loving the secular. And interestingly, Edward Said also writes about the secular in this sort of way too. So it makes me wonder if there's more to think about there. So for Auerbach, according to Porter, history knows only promise, it knows no fulfillment and no eschaton. So I'm just going to leave with one last question. Max, I would love to know more about why you chose the cover image that you did. I really appreciated the cover note in explaining the art, which I think we all should do more if we're picking pictures to to invite people into our books. But I want to know more. So who is this all-pervading spirit who holds the whole world in her hands? And why does this figure or this image represent the tension between religiosity, Christianity, and secularity, as you state in your note? What would it do to your argument to think of the image as representing other trinities of polemical concepts, such as woman, world, and whiteness? And that your book raises so many interesting questions. Here's a couple more of them. Why does power need time? Why does power need glory? Is a testament to its contribution. Those, of course, are not only, Max makes clear those are not only his questions, but he's also asking them. And I would also say that some of the questions you raise remain unanswered is just as important just an important aspect of your book. So thank you so much for writing it and for inviting me to be here.
Thank you very much, Pamela.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. It may be worth noting that today is one of those time-laden days in the Christian calendar. It's Ash Wednesday, so I don't know what difference that might make to our conversation. Anyway, thank you very much for that engaging response, Pamela. We'll move on to Travis Kroeker. Travis is professor of religious studies at McMaster University. He's the author of a number of books and articles, including Messianic Political Theology and Diaspora Ethics, and Empire Erotics and the Messianic Economies of Desire. His teaching and research ranges across conversations in theology and ethics in Western thought and culture, which he explores through comparative studies of a diverse range of texts, from Plato and the Bible and Augustine to modern and postmodern works of philosophy, theology, and literature. His current research project is on literary apocalypse as political theology. Welcome, Travis. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much. And thanks to these earlier presentations, there's so much there that I would love to pick up on. I will be picking up on some of the things that that Pamela was just raising in a different register, perhaps in one of those registers that is both problematic and ambiguous, called theology. But I would also relate it to philosophical register. Anyone who's read Max's book will know that he is an exciting scholar to think with, and I'm so grateful to have been able to spend 5 years together with him at McMaster. The intellectual liveliness, the curiosity, the careful close reading, and the collegial affection that Max brought was memorable and is memorable. This book puts all of those gifts on display. There's obviously way too much to respond to. Every one of us is going to say that. And given that Max wrote a couple of these essays in seminars we were in together, I'm going to focus my responses to those in particular, and in particular on figures such as Augustine, Nietzsche, and Melville, with a little Walter Benjamin and Auerbach thrown in for good figural measure. I wish we could talk a lot more about Auerbach. And Porter is great on this, and Porter is also, I will hasten to say, one of the best interpreters on Nietzsche that I've been reading. He's remarkable and so relevant to these conversations. But what I want to do here is I want to proceed a little bit provocatively, and you know, a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be implicit provocation rather than overt, but Max can do with that what he wishes. But I want to wonder out loud, in a similar way to what Pamela was raising, just how useful the language of post-secular history is. Indeed, hoping perhaps even that it ain't so programmatically. Both, and I will say this, both in the literal Augustinian sense, that would suggest that we'd then be out of time, literally. Just as, you know, language of the post-human, or even worse, the transhuman, might suggest we're out of nature too. And in that sense, worrying, but also in the figurative sense, intended in Francis Fukuyama's book from the 90s, you know, called The End of History, which he paired with the triumph of the Nietzschean nightmare, the last man, which proves, I think, just how prophetic Fred Jameson was and is when he said that it's easier for us now to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I'm nervous about all of this post language. But let's begin with Augustine on the secular, because he's really the first thinker about the saeculum in a theological and philosophical and political philosophical sense, who argued, you know, that human beings are creatures of time and in time, but they neither control nor manage it. And you know, he says famously, you know, what is time? I know full well what it is until someone, you know, asks me what it is, because then it becomes the mysterious thing that it is. And I think he's, you know, related very much to the biblical tradition on this. You know, if they are to be, as Paul puts it in the New Testament, if people, Christians, let us say, whoever those might be, if they are to be political economists of the divine mystery, they can only try to pay attention to what it means to be created somehow in the image of a providential God who remains a mystery, and whose governance of that created order is one that is, for him, most profoundly articulated in the notion of the mysterious hidden power of divine love, which is also Augustine's premise for a providentialism. It is not, in fact, it is polemically opposed to the view that it could become the visible love of power, humanly governed, controlled, and so on, and perhaps evident above all in another visible God, the mysteriously named Mammon, you know, toward which many forms of secular power have been hyper attempt, no less in the ancient world than in our contemporary one. But this is revealed for Augustine, for Paul, in what they you know, call the messianic drama. This is the importance of the language of story. It's a drama and not a theory. It's not a doctrine. So I mean, Paul says overtly, if you think of this as a knowledge, you are misunderstanding. Because this is a drama that entails you becoming known by that which exceeds you mysteriously. And this is really the drama of this of secularity, and above all, perhaps one could say in this register of secular politics. That is, it is to be done through the building up of the world, the saeculum, through acts of humble love. Both of these figures are going to emphasize that, rather than tearing it apart through power, knowledge, institutions, and practices of control, and that are rooted in the lust for domination in both time and space, that are diminishing of the life of the given world. Well, no less, I think, than in the ethics of global citizenship in the cosmopolitan Roman Empire of Paul and Augustine, does our modern global imperial quest for salvation. There's no less a quest for that, I would argue. Consider the foolish teachings of the second Moses that they're appealing to here, expressed in the poetics, one could say, the poetics of the Sermon on the Mount, to be utterly irrelevant to the quest for happiness in the real world of the saeculum. Well, so Jesus taught in parables, parables that Augustine suggested display the only possible way to live in a divinely authored economy of ongoing providential life. That is, the secular world, the world we inhabit, does not belong possessively to human sovereigns or sovereignty. It is a divinely given gift at every moment. It contingently, not programmatically, but contingently, to be shared like bread with all who beg for and share bread in this way. And I'm teaching Simone Weil right now, who says the same thing. Her view in Gravity and Grace is God gives us existence in order to beg it from us in a reciprocal exchange. That also remains mysterious. She calls it decreation. Augustine calls it deification. They're very similar economies of how to relate, what Auerbach calls the transcendental or vertical dimension with the historical, horizontal human communal dimension, but does so figurally in a way that will also work all the time with language of paradox and reversal. And I think it's also why, well, let's just say this: there is no salvation to be found in institutional power and identitarian human purity, whatever religion, whatever communal form that might take. Everything in the world is secular, fragile, vulnerable, mortal, and kept alive only by divine love, the breath of life. And this is why Augustine is so deeply ambivalent about all justice claims having to do with this, that want to control that discourse ethically. Like all virtue language, tied to the knowledge of good and evil, as if this could be humanly controlled or instituted as a techne to be manipulated and controlled. This quickly then becomes a destructive fantasy. The endless erotic pursuits of final solutions to the problem of evil, humanly understood and imposed, that always end yet again in forms of violence and death, new forms, one could say, of hell on earth. Well, I don't want to get too carried away with these depictions, but I do tend to get carried away a little bit by these dramatic moments and how they are to be inhabited in thinking with them, which I think is something that Max is also trying to do. And I do think that Augustine's language of distension of the soul, distentio animus, in which we keep time in the saeculum, is above all related not to time and space per se, but rather to the question of how closely human beings are attuned in forms of similitude, figural forms, to the dramatic movements of divine love displayed in these exemplars that inhabit that pattern of motion, rather than in the dissimilitude, the disfigurement of the self-interested pursuit of our own privative forms of happiness, the diminution of time and space, the secular world. So temporality in this sense is measured figurally, not spatially, and certainly not mechanistically. Well, so I think this is also highly compatible with the poetic parable of Herman Melville in Moby Dick, which is also a display of this sort of figural realism, I would argue, a realism that must be fully secular, embodied, incarnational, and kenotic, to use the figural dimensions of self-emptying that conform to a participation in a drama that lives in time in terms of some sort of providential divine mystery, which I think can take many, many forms. And that becomes an opportunity for comparative thinking across, images of great difference and otherness and strangeness, because it's so important to become a stranger to oneself in this process, and not assume that I know what I'm talking about. And I love what you do, Max, with intervals in Moby Dick, which I think are closely connected to the Augustinian language of in hoc interim seculo, in this time, in the City of God, he puts it that way, or for the time being, as forms of secular time. That is, that these intervals are porous intervals, that, like Walter Benjamin's arcades, or his splinters, fragments of messianic time, in which he sees the figure, as he puts it in his themes on history. The figure of human history is a messianic image. What does that mean? And I think that those forms of figural porosity are also, I think, critically relevant to our time in the so-called Anthropocene, and that's really important. They're open to these lived meanings across time, but that also connect us to that mystery that's going on beyond us at every breath of time, that are fully immanent, nevertheless, immanent, embodied, and yet displaying this figural porosity of poetic enactments that themselves become, in that sense, parabolic. In keeping with Kafka's famous parable about what it would mean to become parabolic, which is a beautiful instantiation of that, by living freely and dispossessively in the ordinary daily life that we're given every day, full of dramatic possibility, but not on our own managerial terms that want to capture and conquer the mysterious forms of life itself for ourselves and our new forms of building it up in that way, but rather, in what could then become easily and quickly a mad rage against the secular created world that dares to defy our imposed salvific economic orderings. And here I simply want to interject a bleeding objection in Max's book to my characterization. His characterization of me on page 118 is, mapped onto Kroeker's economy of salvation. My God, Max, what do you really think of me in such monstrous ways? As far as I'm aware, I do not have an economy of salvation. I do not want an economy of salvation, not even a map or a chart to provide a link, but rather, but rather than proceed with that, and rather than try to persuade Max of an alternative dramatic reading of Moby Dick that would that is rooted in slavery, which Max doesn't like very much, this notion, which I understand. It's a bad word, and it's a dangerous word. And it's it informs all manner of really complex economies. But Ishmael's question in Moby Dick is really one of the big questions of the text: is who ain't a slave? Who ain't a slave? And who ain't a slave? That's that I think is a question that resonates also throughout these texts. And Melville's intervals, like Augustine's, are not easily charted in terms of pre, post, neo, ana prefixes of spatial temporal location, I would argue. Rather, one might consider them more poetic and existential images of moment, gateway, Augenblick, and the exemplarity of figural narratives. I like your comparative readings, Max, of Zarathustra and Augustine, but I would contest your figural characterization as one between Zarathustra's wandering and Augustine's ordering life. I don't think it's that neat. More interesting, I think, is their contrasting tragic realisms, a category that Auerbach was very interested in, tragic realism. But between Zarathustra's eternal return and amor fati, and Augustine's sometimes called eschatological form of extensio, from distentio through attentio to extensio, but toward a heavenly homeland, which I do not think is an other world in Augustine. The way that Nietzsche feared it might be, or interweltlich fantasy, or a supernature unconnected to secularity. And this, I think, is there also in Simone Weil, but too much to talk about, as always, when we're talking together about topics like this. Thank you for your work. We too, in the age of the Anthropocene, are facing worldly tragedy, and your close readings helped me think about, or to clarify my wrestlings with these poets of what could be called mystical becoming, one Dionysian, the other messianic, Nietzsche, Augustine, which need not be mutually exclusive. Both offer critical resources for Benjamin's messianic figure that brushes all progressivist ideologies against the grain, gegen den Strich, with a weak messianic power, lest we end in another world-destroying transhumanist supernaturalism, perhaps the most recent cauchemar, nightmare of technotopia that many consider another form of salvation. There we are. Enough. Schluss.
Thank you very much, Travis.
Thanks, Travis. That was great. So much to chew on and to engage with. I think we'll go right on to Jennifer Otto, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Lethbridge. She's the author of Philo of Alexandria and the Construction of Jewishness in Early Christian Writings, as well as a number of articles and book chapters. She teaches courses on Christianity, Bible, and Western religions, and is working on a SSHRC-funded research project on remembering Anabaptist martyrs, which investigates the reception and representation of early Christian martyrs among Anabaptists in the 16th century and in the present day. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. And I just want to echo my fellow panelists in saying what a pleasure it is to be here today, and how much I enjoyed reading Max's book. Although I have to say, at times, almost a little bit frustrated reading Max's book, because it was pulling me down so many rabbit holes. And I think like my current bookshelf is just full of books I took out from the library to follow the arguments that Max was taking me on. And I really wanted to know, how do I fit all of this together? And so it was in some ways like just a really, almost like getting to spend some time in Max's brain, which was actually, it was really fun. I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much, Max, for inviting me to engage with your work. I must say, I'm a bit of an outsider to the world of political theology. And so perhaps that's why I was doing more digging through some of these texts to try to understand this field. And I do feel like I have now taken at least an intro course in political theology by having worked through Max's book. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. In my presentation today, I'm going to be interacting with chapter 2 of Postsecular History, titled Political Theology and the Politics of Time, which engages a number of influential texts in the discipline of political theology. I want to discuss one of these influential texts in particular as a way into some of the larger themes in Max's work that has a lot of resonances with what we've already heard today. So I think we'll have a lot of interesting things to discuss in our discussion time in a few minutes. I'm going to be discussing Erik Peterson's Monotheism as a Political Problem. In this essay, Peterson interrogates the analogy between monotheism and monarchy, from its roots in Aristotelian philosophy and Hellenistic Judaism, through its adoption by early Christians and its critique by Nicene theologians and Augustine. Peterson's interest in the relationship between monotheism and monarchy is not purely antiquarian, although he does spend a lot of time going through a lot of old texts. As we shall see, theopolitical concerns in Peterson's own day simmer in the background of his historical analysis. So who is Erik Peterson? He is a Protestant German theologian who in 1924 was appointed professor of church history at the University of Bonn. That's where he met Carl Schmitt, who had recently published Politische Theologie, now regarded as a foundational text in the field of political theology. Schmitt and Peterson became close friends, but in the early 1930s, they parted ways over the question of supporting the rising National Socialist Party. Schmitt joined the Nazis in 1933. By that time, Peterson had converted to Catholicism and relocated to Rome. Although he was acquainted with many of the theological luminaries of his day, Peterson himself was a rather marginal figure until monotheism as a political problem was rediscovered by Schmitt's readers in the 1970s. Written in 1935, this essay takes up Schmitt's concept of political theology, but ultimately rejects the notion that authentic political theology can be derived from Christianity. For Peterson, any claim by a political entity to draw its legitimacy from Christianity is theologically impossible. I want to take a few minutes to briefly review Peterson's argument. He begins by identifying an early example of the analogy between monarchy and monotheism in the 12th book of Aristotle's Metaphysics. Describing the divine governance of the cosmos, Aristotle quotes a line from King Agamemnon in the Iliad. "The rule of many is not good. Let one be ruler." Aristotle applies this political dictum to his cosmology, and Peterson goes on to show how the parallel between human and divine monarchy is further developed in other Aristotelian sources. Peterson then identifies the analogy's first appearance among philosophically educated, trained theologians in the works of Philo of Alexandria, the prolific Jewish philosopher and biblical exegete whose lifespan overlapped that of Jesus. The word monarchy comes up actually only a few times in Philo's relatively large corpus, and it comes up only in a set of treatises that are known by scholars today as the Exposition of the Law. In these treatises, Philo sets out to show that the Torah is not only reconcilable with Greek philosophy, but that Moses is the greatest of all philosophers to have ever lived, and that his law is superior to any other constitution. The concept of monarchy then is brought into the discussion as part of Philo's defense of Jewish monotheism, criticizing those who worship the sun, moon, and stars as though they themselves were uncreated divinities. Philo compares the heavenly bodies to the viceroys or ministers of a great king. It is the king to whom honor is due, not his subordinates, Philo insists. Therefore, worship ought to be paid only to the one creator God and not to any other created beings, and certainly not to idols of wood or stone. As Peterson points out, quote, the divine monarchy has a pedagogical function for Philo, with the help of which the approach to Jewish monotheism is made more comprehensible to the proselytes, end quote. While I would say that few modern interpreters of Philo would read his exposition of the law as intentionally proselytizing, as Peterson seems to do, Philo's position seems to be more defensive. Peterson's larger point, I think, still stands. Philo does indeed explain and justify Jewish monotheistic worship by comparing the God of Israel to a human king deserving sole honor. Now, Peterson doesn't argue that Philo is the first person in the Jewish tradition to associate monotheism with monarchy. After all, the Hebrew Bible refers to Yahweh as a king, but he does credit him with identifying the Hebrew God as synonymous with the single divine monarch of the Aristotelian cosmos, right? So it's the God of Israel is the God of Aristotle. It is the same being. That's the connection that Philo makes that is important for Peterson. And it's important because it's a claim that's also going to be made by early Christian apologists. Now, Peterson doesn't claim that early Christians got the idea that the God of the Greek cosmos and the God of Israel are the same, like directly from Philo, but he rather attributes it to a larger tradition of Jewish religious instruction, of which Philo is one of the chief representatives. He then follows the trail of the monarchy monotheism analogy in early Christian writings, showing how ultimately, and this takes a lot of steps and I don't have time to go through the whole argument, but it's quite fascinating, but ultimately this analogy winds up being used to support claims that specific Roman emperors, first Augustus and then Constantine, were providentially appointed by God to act as imperial monarchs over all humanity on God's behalf, ushering in an age of eschatological peace along with the Pax Romana. But there's a problem with this synthesis. The conclusion that the emperor is a providentially appointed mirror image of the divine monarch runs aground, Peterson insists, on the doctrine of the Trinity. The notion of the Godhead as a mysterious economy of relations is not reducible to the concept of a human king. Thus, the analogy between monarchy and monotheism supposes a kind of Arian subordinationist theology that, in Peterson's mind, is rightly rejected at Nicaea. Moreover, Augustine's disentangling of the city of God from the earthly city rejects the possibility that Rome or any other empire could establish a permanent universal peace. And so, Peterson concludes, quote, the doctrine of the divine monarchy was bound to founder on the Trinitarian dogma, and the interpretation of the Pax Augusta on Christian eschatology. In this way, not only was monotheism as a political problem resolved, and the Christian faith liberated from bondage to the Roman Empire, but a fundamental break was made with every political theology, he puts this in quotes, that misuses the Christian proclamation for the justification of a political situation. Now, as I hinted earlier, Peterson is taking aim at a clear target with this essay, and it's not Augustus and it's not even Constantine, but it's Hitler. And the way that some of Peterson's Christian colleagues, including Carl Schmitt, had identified in him a defender of a particular kind of conservative Christendom that they felt was under attack. Peterson's essay ends with a rebuke of this notion. The mystery of the triune God is so profound, so far beyond human comprehension, that no human being, no human political order could ever be said to mirror God's rule or to be capable of instantiating the peace of God in its eschatological fullness. Monotheism as a political problem begins with a quote from Augustine. Pride has a certain hunger for unity and omnipotence, but in the primacy of natural things, all of which are as transient as a shadow. The cosmos is transient, but the mystery of the Trinity exists beyond creation, only in the Godhead itself, inimitable and ultimately incomprehensible to the human mind. Now, Peterson seeks to draw a distinction between Christianity on the one hand and Judaism and paganism on the other hand in this regard. He writes, only on the basis of Judaism and paganism can such a thing as political theology exist. But I was actually struck by how closely Peterson's apophatic conception of God used to Philo's. In the same treatise on Special Laws 1, in which he discusses monotheism, Philo insists, quote, we cannot attain a distinct conception of the truly living God. He continues now this time in God's voice. He has God respond to the human eager for divine knowledge. Do not then ever expect to be able to comprehend me, nor any one of my powers in respect of our essence. But as I have said, I willingly and cheerfully grant unto you only such things as you may receive. So both Peterson and Philo warn strongly against the dangers of inflated confidence in human comprehension and human achievement, specifically political achievement. Our minds have limits, and how we live within the limits of our capacity to know is a theme that comes up repeatedly in Max's book, especially with regards to his arguments about periodization. Much of the past is lost to us, and the future is not given. Any attempt to parcel time runs the risk, in Max's words, of imposing necessity onto contingency. Now, when I consider how I think about dividing time, and I thought a lot more in the last few weeks about how I try to divide time into periods, whether that's when I'm like constructing a syllabus for a class, or even if I'm just like reflecting on my own life, it seems to me that my periodizations are granted to a certain extent arbitrary, but they're also useful as a means of making comprehensible the span of time that is actually beyond my true comprehension. Moreover, as I read Max's book, I did sometimes find myself wondering whether we need to take more consideration into the way that the physical cosmos and our physical bodies actually impinge upon our periodizations, as well as political and theological factors. So the division of time into days, lunar months, seasons, and years reflects the rhythms of the natural world of which we are a part. And when we tell our own life stories, periods are often imposed upon us in the form of births, deaths, injuries, illnesses, natural disasters. Given the ways that periodization is, I would argue, part of the structure of the cosmos and a helpful aid for human comprehension, I wonder, is periodization necessarily very problematic? Or might we alternatively consider it to be an imperfect but useful strategy that allows us to make shared meaning possible, especially acknowledging our status as created beings possessed of a limited capacity to know. So I'm interested in your responses, Max, and to hear also more from the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks so much, Jen. My internet is playing games on me, so I have called in, so that's why you're not seeing my face right now. But thank you very much for that. Hopefully we can continue on this way. I'm going to invite Max to respond, and I'm going to introduce him here to Max, if that's okay. So Max Kennel is a Shirk postdoc fellow in the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. He completed his PhD in May 2001 at McMaster University with a dissertation entitled Ontologies of Violence, and has taught courses on religion and violence and approaches to the study of religion. He has published a number of articles and is the editor of Robert Friedman's Design for Living: Regard, Concern, Service, and Love. Max also served as a guest editor for a recent special issue of the journal Political Theology that focused on interdisciplinary expressions of Mennonite political theology, and he is director of Pandora Press. His current research is focused on a book project entitled Critique of Conspiracism. So with that, Max, I will turn it over to you. Really glad to have you here and be able to celebrate this launch with you. So turn it over to you, Max.
Thank you so much, Kyle. So I'll respond in no particular or a different order. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Jen and Travis and Pamela and Mike and for responding to my book. And I'm so grateful to Kyle as well for the introduction and for organizing this symposium. I think I'm feeling the embarrassment of riches to have such thoughtful and attentive mentors and friends. And so all I can do is try to respond in kind and with care. So here we go. So I'm going to begin with Jen's challenge that was posed at the end of her response. And she notes that there is a problem when we become too confident in our ability to comprehend and know, and rightly points out that in the book, I repeatedly warn against overextending our limited capacity to know what time it really is. So upon reflection, though, I worry a little bit that my continuous warning about supposedly inherent human limits, it could fall into a conservative tendency to just preserve the status quo and keep what cannot be kept. But I'll set that aside for a moment. So Jen, I really appreciated your encouragement to move away from seeing these limits as inherently problematic and perhaps toward an understanding of our periodizing activity as something imperfect but useful. And I also appreciated what I think is your related encouragement to turn toward the rhythms of the natural world, to look for useful periodizing figures there. And I'm very glad that you cited the personal examples like creating a syllabus or looking at one's life story. I think these indications are important because one way we fall into the trap of overconfidence is to dissociate from the everyday rhythms of life because of a desire for universal or universalizing means of situating ourselves in time. There can be no universal time. Everyone experiences it differently, and all periodizations, even the most seemingly natural, are culturally, linguistically, and geographically situated. In your response, you said, quote, that much of the past is lost to us and the future is not given. And I agree. I think many of our attempts to parcel time respond to what Hartmut Rosa calls the uncontrollability of the world. And we respond to this uncontrollability by turning toward the predictable rhythms of nature in an effort to predict the future. And I observe that there's a kind of flexibility in the natural world that might give us these imperfect but useful tools you refer to. So for example, in one sense, a day begins with sunrise and ends with sundown. And then in another sense, more chronological, the day begins and ends with numerically fixed time points that we see on a clock. So the day is something both fixed by a noon point and accompanying AM-PM distinction, ante meridiem, and then post meridiem. But a day is also flexible because the sun doesn't always rise and set at the same time or in the same way. And that depends not only on where one is, but also how one feels. But since earlier in the week, I responded to Marie-Josée Delbros's book, The Charismatic Gymnasium, which I encourage you all to take a look at. It's great. Since reading that book, I've been thinking more about how flexibility may not be as positive as it's often presented. So in some ways, I appreciate the flexibility and usefulness of naturally occurring forms of time. But in another way, I remain very skeptical. And not so much because I don't think that, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, and years are helpful. I mean, I depend on them quite a lot in order to organize my past and present and future. Instead, I'm skeptical about depending on these terms because of their so-called natural status. And although I don't hear you saying this, Jen, I do feel hesitant every time I hear appeals to nature, because they so easily just naturalize the unnatural and conceal normativity within the guise of description, much like the polemical concepts that Pamela mentioned. So I wonder, how do natural ways of periodizing time conceal a normative remainder, even when appearing to be only natural? And this is just an open question I have. So although I'm hesitant about any periodizations that would present themselves as natural, I resonated very much with the autobiographical and narrative ways of periodizing a life story that you mentioned, these births, deaths, injuries, natural disasters. And now I suppose that being born and dying or experiencing crises is somewhat related to our physical nature, but I'm more inclined to see these periodizing markers as being matters of interpretation and narration. Surely we all divide our lives up using births and deaths, and surely we remember the past by distinguishing between pre and post. I mean, I'm thinking especially in the case of global events like 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, the Trump presidency, the coronavirus pandemic, and now the invasion of Ukraine. I'm thinking about these terms, and I work a lot more with these kinds of distinctions, like the birth-death distinction in my dissertation. And I think there's so many possibilities for renewing our violent periodizing habits by refocusing on birth instead of, but not at the expense of, death. And so here I'll just point out to Grace Jansen's wonderful trilogy, Death and the Displacement of Beauty. So lastly, Jen, thank you for covering Eric Peterson's monotheism as a political problem. I see this analogy between monotheism and monarchy. I see it as a way to talk about how the desire for unity is a powerful problem. And although I want to reject Peterson's idea that the mediations and dispersions of the Christian Trinity are really that protective from the totalitarianisms he's rightly concerned about. I think there's really nothing about a dispersed mode of governance or the mediations of the Trinity that can protect us from the violence of fascism today or in the past. There are just so many ways that empires legitimate themselves in the eyes of populaces. And these ways include both political multiplicities and unities. And Jen, you point out that Peterson sees the mysterious nature of the Trinity as something that prompts humility before our limited comprehension. That's true, but again, I worry that mystery too often is mobilized and used to mystify and justify violent actions and violent ways of thinking. But I'll have to leave it at that in the interests of time, because we're punning. I'll conclude with my sincere thanks for your engaging response. And I'll move on to my response to Travis, which I've titled Weak Messianic Power. So the problem of confidence in human comprehension is also one that we encounter in Travis's response, and I encountered it in his seminars at McMaster. And so thank you, Travis, for your persistent efforts to loosen my grip on my own certainties and favorite concepts in the interests of a more flexible way of thinking and being in the world. So I'll start my response to Travis with some reassurance. I think maybe we all need it. Some reassurance that I do not see the term post-secular in a programmatic way. And although my book does attempt to recover the term as a flexible way of naming entanglements between religion and secularity, I wouldn't defend the inherent value of the term post-secular in any strong way. And this is because postures of strength and defense are indeed the problem, both for my work on periodization and in Travis's messianic political theology and his distinctive critique of possessive desire. So the weak messianic power that Travis draws from the work of Walter Benjamin and others, it continues to intrigue me because in some sense, this weak messianic power is not power. If power means some oppositional use of force to push means toward ends in linear and violent ways. But if power really is found and weakness, as some of the best representatives of the Mennonite tradition argue, then I'm interested in the precise character of this weak power. So I think power can be found in messianic weakness in many ways, both positive and negative and in between. There's a negative and toxic form of weak messianic power that appears when political leaders, for example, use narratives of victimhood to present themselves sympathetically while engaging in distorted messianisms that desire control over people and territory. But in some ways, that's not really a weak messianism because it conceals its possessive desire, its libido dominandi, under a veneer of vulnerability. It appears vulnerable, but it really is not. On the other hand, we have the suffering servant Jesus Christ, whose weakness appears in parables that confound the readers with profound mysteries. But again, these mysteries remain vulnerable to abuse, such as the suffering servant motif being used to promote patriarchy. So even the use of the term weak messianic power is vulnerable to the very thing it responds to. And here I'll confess that years ago in a book symposium on Travis's messianic political theology and diaspora ethics, I did not really understand this part of his work. And I responded to his weak messianism as if it were a form of powerlessness that couldn't politically intervene, when in fact it is the mode of intervention that matters. So this paradox of weakness and power in the messianic figure who's always yet to come, but always arriving, I think is so fulfilling to think about and learn from. But I wonder, maybe provocatively, if there's anything past messianism or post-messianic that I could provoke Travis into discussing later. So Travis confesses his nervousness about all this post language. And in some ways, I want to reassure him that this prefix is just a way for us to talk about deeper problems with how we manage time. But I also kind of want to make him more nervous because as I learned from him, we should maintain a certain level of anxiety about the scandalous and dangerous character of our ideas, especially the figure of the Messiah in the parables of Jesus. Anytime we think we've made our thinking safe, calmed our nerves, our desire for a sanitized or clean perspective can lead to possessive self-defeat, where the very things we desire to conserve and preserve are crushed in our grasp. So perhaps it's about cultivating the right kinds of nervousness about how we think and speak and know. So Travis, I agree with you when you say, quote, temporality is measured figurally, not spatially, and certainly not mechanistically, end quote. So I agree with that. But when I first read this sentence, I wanted to challenge your descriptive use of the word is, because the problem is that in many discourses, temporality is not measured in helpfully figural ways. But then I thought, well, it is also the case that even when we think we're measuring time by dependable spatial and mechanistic means, the figural aspects of time remain like a messianic mustard seed within these chronological terms, sometimes even breaking these idolatrous concepts and showing their cracks and weaknesses. So as I mentioned, even when we think we have happened on a stable and predictable way of periodizing time, value-laden interpretations and narratives are never far behind. So maybe this sentence from your response that temporality is measured figurally, maybe it is descriptively true if we conceive of the figural in that precise way. So Travis closes with a further challenge for me to think about how these pre, post, neo, and prefixes of spatio-temporal location, he encourages me to think about how they're different from poetic and existential periodizations in the work of the thinkers I engage with. And I agree, in short, but my time runs short, so I'll periodize my response with a deferral and a promise of more engagement on another day. So I'll move now to respond to Pamela's engagement with the book because it also concerns the figural. So thank you, Pamela, for taking time to respond to my work. Your challenges are consistent with the ways you've been pushing me to reconsider my methodological orientation in my postdoctoral project on the critique of conspiratorial reason, and they are so helpful. So you ask about how place and story fit into my analysis, and you rightly point out that I frame my work, I think, at the expense of the real ways that place and story or spatiality and context are just as important as temporal and historical visions. So I'll confess, part of this overcorrection is biographical. This book was written over 6 or 8 years when I lived in at least 5 different cities. And so I have found place and routes to be kind of unreliable at times. And so instead I looked to time and history for anchors as I navigated graduate school. But that's no reason to turn a blind eye to space and place. And although I want to provide a gentle corrective to the way that political theology tends to favor spatial analysis of sovereignty, I also want to attend to the ways that the earth and our place on it is highly important for the entanglements of religion and secular life. So thank you for reminding me that dividing time from space so sharply, it distracts from how every story and concept has a physical, geographical, and spatial set of roots. So you write of how the religious and secular are always local and even geological. And I'm excited to hear more about your project on gold rushes as it unfolds. And you remind me that Auerbach's idea of the figural is located in space and time. I worry that I may have lifted it from its author's exilic Jewish, German, Turkish context for my own purposes. And in some ways, this feels like a fine thing to do because Auerbach describes the figural as something that is based on nonlinear connections between themes across space and time. But I don't want to disconnect the history of this term from its context in Jewish and Christian ways of thinking. So better to broaden my horizons, I think, and to follow Pamela's helpful challenge to think apart from Christian concepts and capture. So Pamela, you ask if in your response, if theology is always Christian. And in a descriptive sense, I would say, unfortunately, yes, because the term theology is so often forcibly controlled, preserved, and managed by Christian theologians, even in some very well-meaning efforts to include other traditions under the banner of theology and its very Greek confluence of theos and logos. But I take your point that, in some ways, I think despite my best efforts, I'm still using the term theology in very Christian-centered ways. And this has been something I've been attempting to correct in my work. And your point about Dan Barber's anachronistic use of the term religion, it's exemplary of this problem. And it reminds me of a book that I know that Jen has reviewed called Imagine No Religion by Daniel Boyarin and Carolyn Barton. And I'll just kind of point out to that one as one that I've been very challenged by. But I'd like to close this part with a reflection on place and an answer to Pamela's question about the cover art, which is George Frederick Watts's The All-Pervading. So Amy and I have just moved from southwestern Ontario to Thunder Bay, where the land is very different. There's more snow and less humidity, and the Sleeping Giant and Mount McKay are the new backdrop to our life. And so when we arrived, we both mistook Mount McKay for the Sleeping Giant because we can see Mount McKay from our window. Maybe it was narcissistic. And we made this mistake until we were corrected by some locals who seemed kind of taken aback by our confusion, which I thought was funny. So since then, in an effort to learn about the land that we're now settled on, I've been reading a book called Gichikami Hearts by Linda Lagarde Grover. And in the book, she describes how several hours from where we are in Duluth, Minnesota, there's a place called the Point of Rocks that divides Duluth in half. So rather than how noon divides daily time, this is a physical and spatial formation of rock that divides a city. And the city was named after Daniel Grayson sur Duluth, but its original name is Onigamising. And the author of this book remarks that everyone in the city would likely have a different idea about just exactly where the Point of Rocks is located. And this confusion made me feel a little better about my own confusion, confusing Mount McKay and the Sleeping Giant. And I think that this Point of Rocks in Duluth is a helpful figure that challenges my temporally preoccupied mind, because this Point of Rocks divides. It divides a city, and its name points to divided histories. And the rock face itself bears the scars of attempted mining. And it further divides rich and poor, Ojibwe and settler. And so I think maybe it's these complex separations and joinings that are like a stitch seam that simultaneously represent division and merger. I think it's that kind of chiasmic or chiastic image that also drew me to the cover image for the book. And so although Watts names his piece The All-Pervading, which is kind of a totalizing title, my sense is that his way of thinking and seeing were anything but unified. And so in short, I was drawn to this image because it resonated with my own problematic desires to understand the world and to understand the world as one. Just as much though, I was drawn to Watts's description of it as representative of, here's a quote, he sees the all-pervading as representative of the density of the veil that covers the mystery of our being, at all times impenetrable and to be impenetrable, in spite of which our conviction we passionately yearn to pierce it. So rather than a piercing analysis, I can only point to my own confusion and density when it comes to matters of space, because I'm only beginning to put down roots after a time of displacement. I suppose what matters, though, is how one does so, especially because patriarchal and colonial desires to suppress women, unify the world, and articulate anti-Blackness they're hidden inside simple stories of settling on new land. And so this is why, Pamela, I really appreciate your closing sentence that some of these questions remain unanswered, and that's just as important. And I appreciate it because it points to the colonial desire to explore all, know all, and answer every question with a form of totalizing certainty. So I'll turn now to Mike's to my response to Mike's response, and I've titled it Short Circuits. And Mike's response remained mysterious to me because the notes he sent me were in the form of images. And this is so fitting for a book launch that takes place on a screen and unfolds in visual and virtual ways. And so fitting also with Mike's way of thinking and speaking in ways that I don't think text can ever capture. I think this image of the short circuit that Mike finds in Toscano's work is fascinating, and it points to the uncritical ways that thinkers tend to jump from era to era and uncritically reproduce polemical concepts with the assumption of their neutrality. I've been inspired, as he said, by his work on the Radical Reformation, especially his insight that to speak of radicality involves an implicit affirmation of a stable center that doesn't really exist. So I'm going to move to some paper notes here, and I'll also point to another fun visual connection. My friend gave me the book Amish Vampires in Space. I don't know if we're familiar with that book, but it's yet another one of these strange entanglements of the world of the Amish and a cargo ship bound for the stars. But they are not the only cargo on board. Some of it is alive, or used to be. So these connections are fascinating, and they're anachronistic. And I remark in the book in chapter 4, when I'm looking at Toscano and Colas, that anachronism names this disordered, non-chronological relationship with time. And at first I thought, Mike, that maybe your response was going to be a wholesale challenge to anachronisms like the ones that you survey. But then you said at the end that you did defend there certain short circuits that were maybe more fun. And I know that I had fun in my master's and in the chapter on the collegiants. I had fun making these connections that were very anachronistic, connections between the Dutch collegiants of the 17th century and the work of Daniel Colocciolo Barber. But I worried the whole time since I read some peer review reports on the original article, and I continue to worry about this problem of anachronism, wherein we would compare past and present in parts of past and present that are so irreducibly different, where comparison would seem to violate their sanctity. And so I hope I did not do that. But I am still a fan of certain forms of anachronism. And I suppose I'll end with an open question about what kinds of anachronism are good and fun and important and helpful. And what kinds of anachronism or short circuits, as Mike puts it, what kind do we want to avoid? I feel like that's a question in many ways at the core of the book, and a question for figural thinking. If the figura that Auerbach talks about makes connections way across space and time, the next question is how like what are the ways to do that are good and important, and what are the ways that we want to avoid? And so my argument in the book is that we want to avoid possessive, controlling, dominating instrumental relationships between past, present, and future. And so many uses of the term postsecular do that by saying, we're past this, we're over this, and become ahistorical. That's why part of the reason why, as Pamela made that quote, part of the reason why I want to turn post-secular thinking backward, because I also, like several of my generous interlocutors, I also worry about being too forward-facing. But I'll leave it at that with my thanks for your responses.
Thank you so much, Max. That was fantastic. We are running short on time. We're over time. But that's fine. If you need to go. But there is so much stuff here that we could dig into. Maybe we should have done 4 of these and had one person come to each one, because I think we probably could have spent our entire time just with one of these rich engagements.
If you're going now, thank you for coming. I appreciate it very much. I'd be happy to talk more another time.
Yeah, fantastic. If you do have questions, you can feel free to type them in the chat, or raise your hand, give a wave. If you can turn your cameras back on, that would be fantastic. So we can see each other and engage in some conversation. While you're formulating those questions, I will say Max told me that there is a potential link here. I'm going to drop it into the chat, that if you are a student, you can get his book at a slightly less obscene price from the publisher at $25, I think, right, Max? So if you follow that link, if you're not a student, I guess petition your libraries, or
or send me an email. You can send me an email too,
or send Max an email. There you go.
Just a word for the my copy bit. It just takes a little bit to log in through your institutional library, and it should be possible if you got a student card from a subscribing library.
Fantastic, thanks. Okay, so there are a couple of hands. Pamela, I think I saw your hand first, so over to you.
I just want to say 2 quick things, because I'm sure Sean has a much more interesting question than mine. In a graduate seminar a week or 2 ago, one of my students, Ridhima Sharma, wrote a fascinating account, and we were actually reading some of John Kloppenborg's work on voluntary associations, etc. And she just basically asked the very simple question of, well, when is it anachronism and when is it comparison, and how do we decide? Which I just thought was so brilliant and so
exactly
simple, but really very interesting. And then I realized when you're speaking about the figural and the sort of collapsing of time and place, I wonder how much you've thought about ritual in this context, because it does seem to me that ritual is one of these places where this collapsing can happen. I've thought about it in other work in terms of what I call ritual proximity, that is both like bodies in proximity, but also times and places in proximity. But we can talk about that another time, but it made me think about that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Pamela. And I'm also thinking about this stuff in a new way because of a new book by Martin Jay called Genesis and Validity, where he talks about how we assume the validity of something is related to its origins. And I don't know. Thank you for that. That's the clear presentation of the question.
Sean, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you so much, 1, for writing this book, and 2, to everyone else for your responses, which I think have been really generative. And one of the things I thought was super interesting in their responses is that a lot of people latched on to the same thing I did when I first read the book, which is kind of how provocative the kind of ending on Auerbach and kind of figura is. But I thought it was interesting because I found it provocative, I think, in a slightly different way than everyone else did, which is that, so questions have been kind of raised about the kind of limitedness of figura as a mode of interpretation to like a specific thing that Auerbach's pointing out. And what I found interesting about that is that it seems the thing that seemed not to come up is the fact that I don't think Auerbach likes figural interpretation. He thinks it's bad, and he thinks it's bad very specifically because he thinks it's supersession, right? Like the Marcion-Tertullian opposition in Figura as an essay is all about 2 different kinds of anti-Judaism in which the supersessionist anti-Judaism wins out over the more kind of direct anti-Judaism, where Jewish history can be recuperated for Christianity specifically because, which is also kind of the Porter argument about this. So I thought it was really interesting to turn to figural interpretation at the end as this kind of positive model of what it could mean as a kind of promising object or something. And I guess I wanted to hear, more about how you imagine what a non-possessive, I mean, maybe this is like asking too much, but like what a non-possessive figural interpretation looks like when the kind of specific referent of figural interpretation, which I think isn't the only way of, or at least Auerbach definitely doesn't think it's the only way of approaching time, because he gives a very concrete example of other ways of approaching time, which is Jewish history. So one of my questions was, like how is figural interpretation possible in a way that doesn't take the figure for ours in a certain kind of sense?
Thanks, John. I appreciate your question, and I learned a lot from your work during the writing of this, and I wish I could have engaged with it more. But yeah, I think your question is a good one, and I think I probably should have looked deeper and been more clear about the ways that I'm using the figural versus the ways Auerbach is. And I guess part of my hope was that some of the normative push of the book, against possessive, controlling, dominating, instrumental relationships with time would be a check and balance against the kind of figural thinking that the Auerbachs were worried about. And I think it's a real open question as to whether that, would be enough. And I don't think sufficiency is a category here for that either. But so if figural thinking is, in some ways standing against these linear causal, maybe if it stands against certain more violent ways of seeing time, then great. But supersessionism, I mean, it's just this persistent problem that I couldn't undertake to address in any dignified or fully way. But a few years ago at the AR, I think it's 2017, I gave a short or a paper on supersessionism and its periodizing violence, and I worked a little bit with Kendall Sulin's work in The God of Israel and Christian Theology and a few others, and the sense I get from that is that supersessionism is not something that you can just overcome within Christianity, that any honest form of Christianity is going to be at least minimally supersessionalist. I think that's a David Novak thing. So yeah, I mean, my response, I feel like it has to be unsatisfying. I can't, the many of the limitations of the book that I think we're already sort of seeing that prohibit me from really solving that. And so I kind of want to throw the question back to you. Like, do you feel like Auerbach's figura or his, push toward Jewish history as a remedy for supersession, like, where do you feel like this ought to head? I want to be open to.
So I want to make it clear that this is not like, this sounded really attacky. I think I realized after that, but it's only because we're in so many ways working so closely around some similar problems and themes that it like popped up for me. And
I didn't take it as an attack at all, Sean. I really
well
constructive point.
Yeah, in the book. And so this is why I think it's a sort of weird, interesting move. In part because like, so I'm, part of this is that like it's in some ways it's almost cheating for me to answer this question for myself, because I don't have the same kind of theological investment in Christianity moving forward, right? So I don't have to articulating this in a way that remains Christian isn't like,
and I think
a kind of bounding problem for
I'm glad
me.
you bring that up, Sean. I think that is a question too, where like at the core of a lot of the responses and part of the book is that very question of investment in Christianity.
Right.
And when one becomes so or part of the worries about investment in the post-secular as a term. And when we become so invested in a, holding up Christianity or identifying with a specific term and loading it with meaning, I think that's a major problem I've been trying to address. Is like, I think investments are important in some sense, that we ought to put our time and energy into things, but there's that paradox where you become so invested in something, you end up, headed into these forms of self-defeat.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you bringing that up, and I think that like it's such a delicate thing.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting because I think one of the places that our thinking both kind of dovetails and then we sort of go different ways with is the way for you, causality is like one of the big problems with ways of thinking, like causal models of time go together with the kind of delineating models of time, like the ability to chop up time and the ability to think cause and effect is part of the same structure of violence, I think, for you. If I'm
you're seeing something in my work I didn't see clearly, so thank you.
But that seems they're threaded together in a certain kind of way in the book, even if they're not exactly the same problem. And I think I'm less skeptical. I think the other thing is I'm like less skeptical of cause language. And part that's the Spinoza in me. Like I'm a Spinoza kid at the end of the day, and that's like, and so adequate knowledge is not a religion of causes, and time is fundamentally kind of causal in nature, in a way that I don't think, like I'm less, you're sort of more like what we see is your knee-jerk, I think often is to say like what we ascribe that's not there is necessity and what is there is contingency, whereas I'm almost the mirror image in a lot of ways where contingency is, I think, often the thing that I think we want to see because it allows us to narrate a certain kind of freedom that we may or may not be imposed by violence. But that's
Sean, that gives me a ton to think about.
I don't know, but that would be my answer to your kind of like how would you knee jerk this differently? But that's just, again, two different knee jerks, right? Like,
thank you.
Different reflexes.
No, that helps me see this more clearly.
Thanks, Sean. Jen, go ahead.
Thanks. I had a question that kind of kept coming up as I was reading your book, and it's sort of a big one, but I'm curious if you could help me with it. What do you think of the eschaton? And maybe to make it slightly less gigantic, as I was reading your book, it seemed as though this idea of like putting a hope towards something that is outside of the seculum was an idea that you were challenging, or at least somewhat troubled by, until I got to the chapter on Dorothy Söhle, in which the whole idea seems to be that we must wait for, I forget the exact quote, about not settling for what this is. And then I was just kind of confused. So I was just curious, because I find it just reminded me of like reading Charles Taylor and how the way he describes secularity as being like the secular is the conceptual space, again, I don't have the words exactly, where some people have a strong fixed sense of a God and a hope beyond this world, and others don't. And we recognize that it's possible to have both ways of thinking. We don't have this shared worldview. And I found myself, as I was reading then the Söhle part, wondering, how does this fit into your way of conceptualizing post-secularity? Where is the eschaton in the post-secular? Does that make sense?
It does, and your confusion is my confusion, and confusion being a major theme. Where I think, like, initially when I'm talking about eschatology, my worry is always that it's this transcendental, otherworldly, distant thing that it's like a placeholder for our desires. And then, when we get to Dorothy Söhle in chapter 6, what I love about her work is that when she says, this isn't it, she's not saying that in a way that's deferring or deferring. she's saying it in a very here and now way. And I think that maybe that will clear up just some of the confusion, and maybe I should have been more clear in my terminological use of eschatology. But I think those are the axes on which it all goes. Oh, Mike's saying goodbye. Take care, Mike. Thank you very much for your response. We'll be in touch. But yeah, Jen, like I think that those are the axes on which it goes, where if there's a normative push in that chapter 6, it's to move away from otherworldly eschatologies and toward, not immanentizing the eschaton in the violent ways that we see in like fascism and dictatorship and that sort of thing, but having a here and now sense that there's something yet to come and that fulfillments are still possible, but to do so in a way that's not not given to the violent forms of thinking and knowing that I point out. But again, I hope that's unsatisfying. And I'm hearing from Pamela too that I think it makes sense to me temporally that people are having to leave at 5. And so if you didn't have a chance to ask a question, shoot me an email, and thank you so much for attending and coming. And we can keep this going as long as people have time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, all of the panelists, and to you, Max. Maybe I will just say, I think good books not only perform an intervention in a certain way, but they also provoke and generate further conversation beyond them. And I think it's clear from our conversation this afternoon that your book, Max, will do both of those things. So thank you very, very much for this. And we'll all look forward to getting our copies and reading it.